She was seated alone at twin sister's wedding, until a billionaire said, "Pretend you're with me." Lila sat at the edge of a glittering ballroom, a navy silhouette swallowed by waves of silk while the vineyard outside held the last golden light. Chandeliers scattered secrets. Violins braided a tune that promised and concealed. She had learned to fade beside her twin, to let applause crown the brighter face while she gathered the small leftovers of attention. Her smile felt fragile, rehearsed. Her fingers closed over a folded sketch, designs hidden until she believed they mattered. Then he arrived, a precise figure in a tailored suit, moving with restraint that made people look twice. Ethan Caldwell claimed the chair at her side without ceremony, his presence quiet but impossible to ignore. Whispers rose, billionaire, private, rumors stirring under polite conversation. He did not offer a toast, he said, "Pretend you're with me." The sentence landed like a spark. She could have shrugged and returned to the familiar ache of being unseen. Instead, curiosity pulled harder than caution. They played the part, a private arrangement that shifted the room's attention. When their hands brushed, it felt less like a gesture and more like an invitation into an unknown story. Across the hall, someone watched with a smile that kept secrets. And beneath the celebration, a quieter current began, hints of ledgers, signatures that might not belong to the man holding her. The night folded inward, a small moment stretching into a choice that would follow her beyond dawn. Someone passed a folded note into a waiter's hand, the paper's edges nicked and urgent. The name on it was unfamiliar to Lila, but old enough to make her stomach drop and change everything. In a single heartbeat, a private performance became a promise and a puzzle. By the end of the night, nothing would look the same, not even her. Lila remained at her corner table as the reception swelled into a bright, humming constellation. Rows of candles trembled along the long oak boards, while laughter braided through speeches and slow dances. She had long ago learned rhythms that appease crowds. A practiced laugh, a polite tilt of the head, an attentive silence when someone else's hour arrived. Design had become her refuge after she left the newsroom, a place where she could stitch order from fragments. Clients praised the quiet confidence of her layouts, but outside that work, her name often made a surprising apologetic pause before conversation moved on to brighter characters. Eva, in contrast, seemed born under a spotlight. The bride wore laughter like perfume, folding strangers into warmth with a single glance. She danced with the ease of someone who believed the world owed her nothing and had earned everything, and everyone rewarded that grace by leaning in. Lila's twinship with Eva had always been a strange work of balance. Two halves recognized together, one half applauded more readily. They loved each other without cruelty. There had been arguments and quiet truces, a tangle of girlhood secrets, shared dresses, and whispered promises. Still, Lila's shadow felt heavier on days like this, when satin and roses blurred the edges of her smaller victories. She smoothed the navy fabric of her self-made dress and glanced at the bouquet Eva had placed gently on a mirrored tray. The bride's joy was luminous and real, and Lila's chest tightened with a complicated small grief that had lived there for years. Across the room, Ethan Caldwell moved with the contained confidence of someone accustomed to command. He navigated conversations without pretense. Servers cleared a discreet path as if he had become part of the room's architecture. When he took the seat beside Lila, it was an unassuming gesture, but one that rerouted attention. Guests paused mid-sentence and angled toward them, measuring expressions and assigning explanation. Whispers threaded through the crowd like a cashmere breeze. Billionaire, private, rumored philanthropist. Aloof but kind. Ethan did not seek spectacle. He offered a steady presence, a cool hand offering the warmth of ordinary courtesy. He reached for her glass with a motion that was both practical and careful, refilled it as if smoothing away the edges of a nervous conversation. The tiny service, reaching, lifting, pouring, felt intimate in a way that invited the imagination to fill in the gap. Lila noticed how his fingers lingered a fraction longer on the stem, how his eyes watched the pour instead of scanning the room, and she felt absurdly as though she was being seen. She would not have called the pull between them romance. It was simpler, like a current that had found a channel. Still, for everyone watching, it read as a rehearsed alignment, a pair framed by coincidence, a tableau that made gossip taste sweeter. At the head table, Eva laughed at a toast and lifted her glass toward them, a private gesture of sisterly acknowledgement that slid into public approval. Every camera lens tilted its way, phones lifted like small satellites, capturing angles that would later become quite proof of a new possibility. Between courses, someone murmured that Ethan had appeared suddenly in the city 2 years ago and had built a company that people both admired and feared. Another voice speculated about quiet divorces and discreet settlements that kept his name in glossy pages, but away from personal photographs. Lila, whose background in reporting had honed her ears into instruments for fact and inference, cataloged the fragments and arranged them into a pattern without meaning. Her journalism past lived in the habit of following loose threads until they tightened. She still skimmed the margins for inconsistencies, background details that did not match the headline. She remembered nights of interviews under fluorescent lights, the small triumph of a verified source, the strange satisfaction of chasing a sentence that made sense where others saw noise. Design work had taught patience. Journalism had taught timing. Together they made her precise in observation and careful in declaration, a combination that now collected whispers around an unfamiliar name. Ethan's conversation with her stayed unhurried, a thread of simple questions and deft, sincere reply. He inquired about her latest commission, commenting on a fabric she had described with an attention that felt specialized and genuine. Lila told him without flourish about a reclaimed table she had restored, about how old wood found new purpose when given space to breathe. He listened as if that detail mattered. He did not redirect the conversation to himself, which felt like a small, eloquent kindness. At one point, a toddler at the next table darted between chairs and a server's tray tilted dangerous. Lila reached reflexively, hands steady, and as a glass teetered, Ethan's palm touched her wrist. The contact was brief but effective. Together they arrested the spill mid-arc, saving a cascade of champagne from an elegant ruin. For a second the room forgot applause or cameras. A small, ordinary rescue sealed a private moment that felt larger than the crowd. The near miss released a ripple of laughter and relieved exclamation. Still in that instant, Lila catalogued a different kind of possibility. A man who had noticed her reflexes and steadied with an unbidden tenderness. Later, in a quiet lull between toasts, she overheard a cluster of guests at the bar trading rumors with the easy cruelty people permit themselves at weddings. Someone mentioned that Caldwell Security had recently updated its filings, and that a few trusts appeared under different names. A dry corporate fact said with a conspiratorial tone. Another voice added a harsher detail: claims of sudden resignations at the firm, odd transfers, shadowed accounting lines. Lila's stomach pressed cold against her ribs. The old reporter in her cataloged names and dates, muzzled anxiety replacing the wine's warm bloom. She returned her gaze to Ethan, who stood for a moment with his jaw aligned and a shadow passing across his features as if a private weather front had rolled by. He did not explain the gossip, only a small private smile that made less of his face than his invitation. Her instincts told her to be careful. Something in the cadence of those conversations did not line up with the man before her. Yet the man before her kept choosing small human acts: a refilled glass, a hand that steadied an imminent crash, an uncovered interest in the details she loved. Ava, oblivious to the ripples she continued to create, waved a napkin at them and mouthed something that translated as permission to stay close. Lila's chest loosened with a relief so surprising she almost laughed, but the reporter's caution hummed under that ease like a distant string. As plates shimmered with dessert and the band eased into a slow, familiar song, Ethan's voice caught at something unsaid, and his eyes moved past her shoulder with a glance that tightened. The room's attention followed his, and small murmurs rose again. Lila felt those joined looks like a current at her back, pushing forward toward a question she had not meant to ask. As eyes followed them, Lila wondered what Ethan was hiding. Have you ever felt unseen until someone took notice of you? Lila's story shows how one moment can shift everything. Share your own spark in the comment. The band shifted into a slow waltz, and Lila hesitated at the edge of the dance floor, palms cool and curiosity louder than habit. For a moment she considered staying where she was, a solitary figure at the margin, but Ethan's hand extended with a quiet certainty that felt less like a command and more like a promise of safety. She allowed herself to be led, her navy dress whispering against his charcoal sleeve, and the room folded into a soft focus as they moved together in timing that seemed learnt, but gentle. He steered with careful gravity, guiding footfalls that steadied her uncertainty, and his touch along her back was tempered and respectful, a subtle language of restraint that made her pulse settle. They spoke in small sentences, the kind exchanged by people trying to measure one another without confession, and Ethan's voice lowered to accommodate a privacy that belonged only to them in that circular universe of light. He asked about the dress as if threads mattered, and she answered by telling him in plain terms about the fabric she chose and why the hem sat the way it did, and how she preferred simplicity that let texture speak. He listened as if those details disclosed character rather than fashion, and that attention felt like an unscheduled kindness in a night full of staged gestures. While they turned, scent from the table garlands rose, lavender and crushed mint, and it anchored her to the room's warmth, tethering memory to the present as childhood recollections surfaced quietly. Lila recalled afternoons in which she and Ava would trade dresses in their shared room, each outfit a small performance, and how children in the neighborhood would always point at one of them with a certainty that the other would accept without question. She remembered being the twin who followed applause from a distance, the one who learned to smile before she knew why, who developed a rhythm of retreat that felt safe and invisible but also carved out loneliness. These recollections did not arrive with bitterness. Instead, they arrived like old acquaintances, familiar and soft-edged, and they provided context for the odd flutter she felt now when someone's hand held hers as if choice mattered. Between the strains of music, Ethan offered a fragment about himself, an early mention of his mother that hung between them like a folded photograph, small and significant. The kind of detail that suggested history instead of headline. He said her name once in a way that sounded like a private monument, a syllable carrying both grief and gratitude, and Lila caught a curve in his jaw that made whatever rumor she had heard seem more complicated than it first appeared. His disclosure measured the distance between them. He did not spill a biography but merely pointed to an anchor that explained a restraint in his manner. There was loss shaped into manners and service, a contained tenderness rather than public flamboyance. Lila found she wanted to ask more but kept to a simpler curiosity, a few careful questions about childhood streets and small domestic rituals. And when Ethan answered, he added a detail about how his mother taught him to tie a perfect knot or how she had kept a garden that smelled like rosemary and thyme. Those small domestic images softened the outline of a man other accounts rendered as austere, and Lila felt a fissure open in the wall between reputation and person. Rumor on one side, reality on the other. As they moved, she caught hovering glances from surrounding tables, faces that translated proximity into speculation and speculation into gossip. A woman on the far side of the room tilted her chin as if filing away a new anecdote. A waiter passed with a silver tray and the soft clink of crystal, and someone near the bar murmured about Caldwell Security's recent reorganization. A sentence offered like a garnish to conversation but carrying weight under its breath. Lila's reporter instincts prickled. She listened without seeming to, letting fragments assemble into a shape while she kept her smile steady and her feet following Ethan's measured pace. She had spent nights in her former life verifying claims, calling sources whose names tasted unfamiliar and coaxing fact from rumor, and that training sat now behind her ribs like a compass pointing at inconsistency. Guests at a nearby table exchanged a theoretical aside about unusual transfers and sudden firings at the company, the words rolling by like a distant tide but landing with an odd heaviness none of them acknowledged directly. A shadow of unease passed over Ethan's face, a small tightening at the temple, a pause in his breath, and he shifted his arm to cover a part of her back that had been briefly exposed to the room's gaze. An instinct that felt protected. He did not offer a denial to the whispers. Instead, he tightened his hold for a second. Not to claim but to reassure, and the action read simultaneously as comfort and deflection. An answer that avoided words. She thought of her own life in practical terms. A studio where bolts of fabric waited like patient promises. A client who favored clean lines in a morning ritual of coffee and pinning swatches to mood boards while San Francisco fog softened the city skyline. Those realities contrasted with the abstract notion of wealth that surrounded Ethan, and yet the domestic images he shared anchored him to ordinary geography in a way Lila found disarming. When a song ended, the band broke into applause and the room erupted for a moment into full voice. Yet in the hush that followed, Ethan's eyes found hers and he leaned closer with a quiet directness. He said simply, not as a boast but as a careful observation, "You're better at this than you think," and the words threaded between them like an offering that asked for neither explanation nor promise. The compliment landed with the soft authority of someone who had measured potential and chosen to voice it, and in Lila's chest something loosened. An acknowledgement of a skill long undervalued by both herself and others. She wanted to ask what he meant, whether his phrase was warmed by genuine belief or a courteous projection, but conversation folded as voices rose again and a new dance began in the corner of the room. As they stepped away from the center, Ethan's face took on a distant focus. He watched the periphery with a new intent, noting faces and repositioning himself subtly, as if adjusting to factors in the room she could not yet see. For the first time that evening, Lila wondered if the hush of his answers concealed a map of obligations and threats she did not understand. Whether his restraint was shaped by a lifetime of guarding not only reputation but also fragile alliance. Her past as the quieter twin had taught her to read gestures, to decode the tilt of a head and the rhythm of a breath, and those instincts now pulled at her like threads toward a truth that felt both magnetic and dangerous. She found herself watching him watch others and imagining ledger pages and boardroom minutes, a world of signatures and seals that seemed remote from the glow of candles but might be closer than she preferred to admit. Though the music promised ease, It also underscored a tightening undercurrent. Gentleness rubbed against caution, and in the halo of light their steps felt like practice for a stage whose script had yet to reveal itself. Her reporter's instincts toggled like a switch. She cataloged phrases, remembered names, weighed motivations and contradictions, then felt how personal curiosity tangled with a rising affection she could not yet name, a mixture that warmed and alarmed in equal measure, leaving a hollowed awareness that every pleasant gesture might contain a cost she had not been asked to pay. She stepped carefully between desire and caution, aware that some doors open wide while others close without warning, and she noticed every detail. A shadow lingered in his words, pulling her deeper into his world. Ethan arrived at Lila's studio on a Tuesday evening, slipping into a compact space where sunlight measured itself across fabric bolts and sketches, pinned like small maps. The room smelt of citrus oil and fresh linen, a working hush broken by the tick of a second-hand clock and the soft scrape of pencil on paper. Lila moved through her territory with neat gestures, pressing folds, adjusting hems, tapping seams with a practiced eye. Her hands held stories, reclaimed wood tables restored for clients, upholstery reborn from thrifted treasures, and details collected like evidence. After leaving journalism, she had learned to shape quiet strengths into tangible objects, translating reportage's rhythm into measured stitches and durable patterns. The studio had always been honest rather than polished, where mood boards shared wall space with coffee rings and invoices, and the life she cultivated there felt like the truest mirror she owned. Ethan folded into the room without ceremony. He draped his coat on a peg and listened as she explained proportion and drape. He asked precise questions that revealed appreciation for craft rather than a passing compliment. When he spoke, it was pragmatic. Continuing their pretense at selected functions would deflect unwanted attention and provide plausible reasons for proximity to mutual contacts. He sketched a brief plan: joint appearances for 2 months, discreet choreography for interviews, a shared line about acquaintance if approached by press, and a private check-in after every event to confirm boundaries. His phrasing was businesslike, strategic, and absent of spectacle. It respected the mechanics of image rather than the theater of romance. Lila recognized the logic and felt oddly comforted by its clarity. Structure could be negotiated, promises recorded in memory rather than left to assumption. She set terms with an economy born of past compromises. "I am not a prop," she said, and the phrase landed steady in the light. "If I do this, it will be on equal footing. I will not play a shadow for appearances. I need clarity, who we are, what we say, and how we stop." Ethan accepted the condition as reasonable rather than stubborn and proposed short, defined boundaries. No staged kisses, limited press statements, and private debriefs after events. They rehearsed responses and practiced coordinated smiles until gestures felt less rehearsed and more genuine. The act of drafting rules felt like reclaiming agency. Lila treasured the exchange where negotiation replaced assumption, where consent and reciprocity became the currency of collaboration. Agreement changed the rhythm of their days. They learned to share presence without losing privacy, to appear united when necessary and retreat to separate lives when possible. Small rehearsals in the studio taught them conversational cues and subtle timing. It felt performative and honest simultaneously, an arrangement that allowed both to move through rooms without being harried by rumor. Lila enjoyed the novelty of choosing her visibility on her terms, and Ethan's discipline in keeping agreed limits made the bargain tolerable, if not comfortable. Their rehearsals, short, private sessions with coffee and chairs pushed aside, became a training ground for public ease, a way to practice holding hands in light that might later be scrutinized for motive. A trip to a supermarket became an unexpected study in ordinary intimacy. The store hummed with fluorescent light, carts squeaked, and children called for snacks in a chorus that felt like urban music. Ethan navigated aisles with curious attention, pausing before labels and reading ingredient lists as if they conveyed personality. They debated cereal with exaggerated seriousness, Frosted Flakes or Cheerios, an argument that coaxed laughter from them both and drew glances from nearby shoppers. Choosing branded boxes under civic light turned into a ritual of gentle teasing. He framed his preferences as if arguing a case, and she countered with pragmatic reasons that made him grin. Simple choices, milk type, coffee roast, bread style, became a private choreography that made both feel less like players and more like participants in a shared experiment. They stacked groceries with casual familiarity, elbows brushing as they reached for the same bag, fingers grazing while folding napkins into practiced shapes. An elderly shopper offered a small approving smile at their synchronized motions, and a teenager nearby lifted a phone with amused astonishment at seeing a powerful figure act ordinary. The sight of Ethan comparing coffee canisters felt disarming. The man who commanded boardrooms argued playfully about espresso strength and milk alternative. Those minutes humanized headline narratives in a fluorescent aisle and let Lila watch how public assumptions softened when proximity replaced rumor. For her, the supermarket scene was a necessary counterweight to gala glamour. It allowed small gestures to have outsized meaning. While unpacking, Ethan admitted a small domestic preference. Vanilla candles reminded him of a kitchen his mother kept warm with pie and quiet rituals. Lila disclosed that she sometimes designed rooms around childhood songs, letting melody dictate fabric choices. Each small confession narrowed the distance between rumor and reality and made the arrangement less about appearance and more about mutual revelation. They found comfort in exchange, a trade of ordinary details that knit seams between strangers. Those domestic fragments softened the edges of public conjecture and allowed both to build trust slowly, in ways that seemed less fragile than a single press photograph. Ordinary life, however, could not erase an emergent current of unease. As they queued at the register, a man in a suit lingered near the magazine rack, his gaze not on glossy covers but on Ethan with a patient intensity that read like reconnaissance. The man's presence rippled the air and left an aftertaste of surveillance. Lila's reporter instincts tightened at that slight movement. She cataloged the man's features and posture while keeping her voice light, the habit of noticing settling into her like muscle memory. Observing without alarm became automatic. She recorded footwear, watch style, and the careful placement of a hand near a lapel, small clues that suggested the observation was professional rather than casual. Back at the studio, they unpacked basil and sun-warmed bread, amused by the absurdity of stocking a kitchen together. Lila sorted sketches, laying patterns on the work table while Ethan organized cans with an operational precision that suited him. She appreciated the steadiness he offered, an attention to detail that mirrored her own, and a reciprocal pause before decisions that felt like respect. Laughter smoothed edges, and mundane debates kept fear at bay, yet a static awareness hummed along her spine, a sensation that something larger than serial disputes was coalescing just beyond the soft glow of lamps. That evening, she reviewed messages from clients and scanned headlines on her phone. A brief dry note cropped up in a business column. Caldwell Security had updated filings and several trust entries appeared under unfamiliar name. The entry read like routine corporate housekeeping, but adjacent commentary hinted at abrupt staff changes and unusual transfers that some readers framed as curious. Lila set the phone aside, the reporter in her compiling fragments without alarm, but with attention. She resisted the urge to act on impulse. Instead, she cataloged the detail and stored it like an index card until further data arrived. He did not offer denials. Instead, he offered a change of subject and a promise to address concerns privately. His restraint read as practiced and protective, an adult containment that reassured more than it explained. Lila believed in asking questions, not accepting convenient silences, but she also recognized the kind of privacy obligations that wealth sometimes required. For now, she accepted a pause rather than a full disclosure. She could live with uncertainty as long as the agreement kept her agency intact and mutual respect intact. They spent the rest of the night mapping potential public appearances and agreeing on language for interviews, practicing responses to possible probes that might reach beyond polite curiosity. The rehearsal was warm in its ordinariness and provided a sense of control she rarely felt in crowded rooms. As she pinned a mood board to the wall and he refolded a napkin with the care of someone used to arranging outcomes, they found a rhythm that balanced companionship with autonomy. Before Ethan left, he stepped to the window, looking out at San Francisco lights blurring into a white scatter across the bay. He spoke softly, not to explain but to acknowledge. "There are aspects of my life I cannot reveal yet," he said by implication, "and I will protect what I can." Lila accepted the promise as far as she could, a trust built on clearly stated terms that allowed both to proceed on agreed footing. They had chosen a path that made them visible together and private alone, a bargain of companionship and rules. Ever taken a leap that scared you? Lila's choice mirrors those life-changing risks. Tell me yours in the comments. Lila laughed, unaware of the storm brewing. The gala occupied the building's top floors, where glass walls turned the city into a spread of tiny lights, and the ballroom felt suspended above the skyline. Lila threaded through clusters of guests with careful composure, returning nods and brief smiles while her mind quietly inventoried details. Years spent verifying sources and chasing documents had taught her to notice what speakers left unsaid and to assemble fragments into plausible narratives. That quiet training hummed beneath the evening's polite surface and kept her senses alert to nuance. Ethan arrived at her side with unobtrusive timing, as if he had been moving through the room waiting for the right opening. He guided her toward a ledge with an expansive view of the harbor, creating a pocket of relative calm away from cameras and ceremony. He rested a hand lightly at the small of her back in a gesture that felt protective without possessiveness. She observed how his face softened with certain acquaintances and tightened when others approached, a subtle shift suggesting obligations beyond casual preference, and that observation lodged in her mind. Near the buffet, a small group had gathered, and one participant belonged to a network Lila recognized from earlier inquiries involving corporate maneuvering. Their voices remained low but specific. Layered trusts, offshore routing, signatures in place. Those words, when assembled, suggested architecture rather than accident. Her reporter's instincts keyed on repetition and concentration, patterns like those rarely formed without intent. She thought of long nights arranging ownership trails into readable form and felt the familiar, cautious pull of investigation. A flute struck against her palm and champagne arced across a silk hem. Reflex moved before thought. She attempted to steady the glass, but her fingers faltered and droplets scattered. Color rose to her cheeks as sympathetic murmurs spread. Ethan's hand closed on her wrist with exact timing, angling a napkin and offering a light joke that dissolved attention and calmed embarrassment. The small rescue read as practiced attentiveness, and she filed the detail with other modest signs of care. Excusing herself for fresh air, she stepped onto a balcony where the night wind cut sharp and the harbor lights seemed close enough to touch. In the cooler clarity, she opened a public terminal and began systematic checks, director lists, filing dates, trustee entries, and notices of change. Initial returns read like routine corporate housekeeping, bland and placid, but patient parsing revealed entries placed under unfamiliar names and a pattern of rapid leadership change that warranted further scrutiny. A terse message arrived from a compliance contact she trusted to explain opaque filings. The reply was cautious and professional. Structures like these can be legitimate. The contact wrote, yet concentrated holdings under less transparent arrangements increase regulatory attention. The tone encouraged verification rather than alarm, advising corroboration through independent filings and former administrators. Lila stored the note as measured data and planned a deliberate sequence of steps to test the emerging pattern. Back inside the room, Ethan greeted her with a composed smile and asked whether the night air had helped. When she described the phrases she had overheard and a few curious filing details, his response remained controlled. Instead of denial, he asked a precise question about trustee names and filing dates, and suggested he would consult counsel privately. His reaction implied personal stake and strategic caution rather than theatrical rebuttal, which satisfied her preference for evidence over spectacle. The orchestra moved to a livelier set, and guests returned to animated conversation. At a nearby table, someone murmured about sudden departures at Caldwell Security and referenced transfers presented as administrative housekeeping. Such phrases, when spoken casually, took on a different weight when parsed with attention. Sudden exits, restructured holdings, curated privacy. The language of rumor traveled as polite commentary, yet carried potential consequence for those willing to translate jargon into fact. Later, Ethan introduced her to a small circle with easy civility, arranging a public presentation that signaled he managed optics without ostentation. Cameras angled to capture their proximity and flashes recorded staged composure that would later appear polished in feeds. The choreography benefited both of them, credibility for him and visibility for her creative work. She observed the performance within negotiated boundaries and felt a measure of agency despite the artifice, though the public scene did not silence private curiosity. Returning home, she found the familiar scent of coffee and fabric and settled into the ordinary geography that grounded her. Multiple browser tabs opened with surgical focus as she listed targeted contacts for morning outreach. A municipal records clerk, a former trustee administrator vetted in earlier cases, and an independent analyst who tracked registrations across jurisdictions. Each call would require precise phrasing to avoid tipping sources and to gather corroborative leads without provoking guarded silence. A personal unease threaded through professional curiosity. Ethan had shared small domestic anecdotes earlier, his mother's garden, lessons learned tying knots for candle wicks, images that humanized him in complicated tidy assumptions. Individuals could hold tender habits and also oversee complex enterprises. Contradiction belonged to many lives she had profiled. Acknowledging nuance would not excuse wrongdoing, but nuance required her to gather reliable evidence before rendering judgment. She drafted concise messages for morning contacts and reviewed gala photographs for recurring faces near Ethan. Small gestures accumulated into meaningful data, a hand lingering on a cuff, an associate angled toward an exit, conversations that stopped abruptly when specific names surfaced. Those minutiae formed a mosaic that demanded patient assembly. Each confirmed detail would narrow possibilities, and each absence of explanation would increase the gravity of inquiry. Curiosity edged into obligation. Documenting apparent irregularities might expose wrongdoing, upset reputations, or place people in unexpected danger. She weighed those consequences as someone who understood that truth could wound while also offering remedy. Careful confirmation would guard against error and furnish authority to act. Her notebook was filled with bullet points and prioritized leads, cross-reference trustee addresses, confirm resignation dates through filings, and request archived minutes related to last year's bid. Execution required persistence and discretion. She scheduled early calls, drafted neutral questions to avoid leading prompts, and prepared to corroborate each thread before elevating concern. Even method had a gravity. The act of verification demanded time and exactitude that rumor did not deserve. Still, each new correlation tightened a knot of unease. She paused at the end of the list, reading details she had captured across the deeper she dug, the more she feared Ethan wasn't who he seemed. Lila moved quietly through the service corridor, keeping to the shadows so she would not attract attention from passing staff. The stolen badge warmed under her fingers, and its holographic surface bought access to a room that might explain an uneasy pattern. She measured camera sweeps and staff rotations with the same focus she once applied to interviews and deadlines, a habit that now served more than curiosity. The records are a smelt of paper and toner, while fluorescent light hummed above rows of cabinets that held corporate history in neat stacks. A single lamp threw a narrow pool of light across a metal table where she arranged folders and began to read. Transaction lists, trustee names, and routing numbers flowed across pages and connected into faint constellations. When she compared dates and signatures, one entry bore a looping signature she remembered from a gala photograph, the same distinctive slant that had caught her eye as she studied event images. Her reporter instincts moved fast: record everything, photograph the most relevant pages, note timestamps, and protect sources. She used a compact camera to save images, angling shots away from overhead sensors, and making mental notes while keeping hands as steady as possible. The hush broke when footsteps sounded in the corridor, and a doorway filled with a figure she knew too well. Ethan entered with no dramatics, expression taut, and the strain in his face suggested a mixture of anger and exhaustion rather than pure fury. He spoke with a quiet intensity, asking why she had come and whether she trusted him enough to ask for the truth. Her answer was calm, built from a lifetime of seeking verification. "These entries require scrutiny," she said, "and I could not ignore them." The room tightened around the exchange, and words moved at an even pace, accusation matched by explanation in the small fluorescent-lit theater. He accused her of violating privacy by rifling through operational files and warned that exposure might harm people who depended on discretion. She countered with professional duty and the ethic that had guided her in journalism, insisting on corroboration before drawing public conclusions. A complex conversation followed where neither claim fully dismissed the other, and both revealed parts of private history they had previously kept between them. Ethan admitted that operational secrecy sometimes necessitated complex structures, that counsel reviewed sensitive transfers, and that disclosure could cause harm. His explanation did not amount to exculpation, but offered a moral frame in which confidentiality served a protective purpose. She pressed him with details from the documents, naming dates, trustee addresses, and routing chains that suggested more than routine housekeeping. He listened, sometimes asking questions about provenance, sometimes offering partial context, and he agreed to attempt a legal review that might address the issues. The conversation ended without resolution, standing instead on a delicate agreement. She would hold publication pending independent verification, and he would seek counsel review. A metallic click down the corridor changed the moment. His posture shifted instantly, and the private exchange folded back into professional posture. He told her firmly to leave the premises and gave the instruction in the tones of someone who meant both safety and boundary. She walked back into the cool night air, thinking about his words, feeling both the sting of exclusion and the strange comfort that came from the promise to seek clarity. At her studio, she laid images under lamplight and examined signatures until strokes became legible and patterns coalesced into a clearer picture. The next morning, a brief bulletin announced a senior resignation at Caldwell Security, and the public note felt like confirmation moving into view. She cross-referenced filings throughout the day, and found clusters of entries associated with unfamiliar trusts and swift changes in leadership at odd intervals. Each new correlation made the matter less anecdotal and more structural, a system of decisions that required patient inquiry rather than a single accusatory headline. Still, she thought of the private texts they had exchanged, small domestic details and jokes that softened headlines into human reality. Those ordinary fragments complicated her assumptions and added a layer of personal risk to professional duty. Late at night, she drew the blinds and noticed a parked car down the block with windows dark and engines silent in a way that suggested intentional waiting. The sensation of being observed prickled along her skin and turned methodical curiosity into a cautious awareness that extended beyond documents. She drafted careful questions for contacts and prioritized calls to former trustees and clerks who might clarify ownership trails without raising alarms. In the quiet hours, she found evidence of marginal initials and authorizations that hinted a third party could have authorized transfers later attributed to other signatures. The possibility of forgery opened new angles and suggested motives rooted in resentment or ambition within the organization. She realized that proving manipulation would require more than a single photograph or a copied page. It would demand corroboration from multiple independent sources. With folders spread like a low horizon, she felt the burden of responsibility weighing against the pull to expose wrongdoing immediately. Either exposure or concealment carried consequences. Revealing facts might destroy careers or remove protections, while silence could allow harm to continue. She paced between duty and empathy and tried to design a path that honored both truth and human cost. At dawn, she noticed a brief headline about another departure and felt a hollow validation that the story was broader than she first suspected. The city around her seemed ordinary yet charged, every shadow a possible whisper, and each passerby a potential piece of a wider puzzle. She worked through contact lists and composed neutral messages so that sources would not feel endangered while offering information crucial to building a rigorous case. As evidence accumulated, she felt both the clarity of method and the ache of complication, because she had come to care for a man whose handwriting had led to questions. She understood now that truth was not a simple release, but a lever that moved other lives, sometimes with violent consequence. In the pale hours of morning, a soft metallic click at the window sharpened her awareness, and she spotted a figure moving behind a parked car as if monitoring her pattern. Her heart stuttered at the clear sign that surveillance was not merely imagined and that corporate maneuvers often carried shadows into domestic space. She gathered documents and prepared to act with patience and precision, aware that careful verification would be the only ethical route forward. She paused and typed a careful prompt to her followers, a rhetorical question into the night. Ever doubted someone you cared about? Lila's struggle hits close. Share your story below. The line felt deeply intimate in that empty studio, a small bridge from private turmoil to communal empathy. She did not yet know whether answers would heal or harm, but she felt compelled to seek truth with measured resolve and compassion. But someone else was watching, and Lila was no longer safe. Lila stepped out into a cooling fog that draped the city like a damp shawl, the studio's light vanishing behind her as if swallowed. Her tote bumped against her hip and pavement chilled the soles of her shoes. A black SUV idled under a sodium lamp. A door yawned open and hands dragged her toward shadow with a blunt efficiency that left no room for startled pleas. She fought, breath hitching, heels scraping concrete as two figures hauled her into the vehicle. Leather straps bit into wrists. Rough rope later rubbed raw where cords pulled tight. The SUV moved through empty avenues where fog hugged shopfronts and sodium halos blurred into watercolor until it stopped in an industrial strip where fog pooled thick between warehouse doors. They shoved her into a cavern of metal and echo where stale air smelt of oil and old cardboard. Fluorescent bulbs hummed overhead, and links of chains swung like indifferent metronomes. Victor Lang stepped from the shadow with a smile that did not reach his eyes, his silhouette lit by a single bulb that haloed his shoulders. He circled her slowly as if admiring a found object, and Lila counted features with a primal clarity that sharpened adrenaline into thought. Victor did not waste time on small talk. His voice was a practiced instrument. Greed shaped his tone. He laid a stack of documents on a metal crate, copies of transfers and notarized authorizations, then pushed one under her nose. The paper bore Ethan Caldwell's signature in a slant she had studied for weeks. Victor's grin widened. "Convenient, isn't it?" he said, amusement thin as paper. He traced a finger along routing numbers and spoke of motives: resentment, the promise of a quicker rise if someone else took blame, and the thrill of watching a titan stumble. He narrated years of smoldering ambition and a plan hatched with careful cruelty, and his words dripped with a relish that made Lila's skin crawl. Her wrists burnt when ropes were tightened, The pain anchored reality. She kept a steady breath and cataloged everything like notes on a scene. The clink of a chain, the dust motes in the bulb's light, the way Victor's shoes scuffed concrete as he paced. She thought of Ava's laugh, warm and careless at the wedding, and of small moments with clients whose faces had believed in her care. Fear pressed cold against her spine, but clarity remained. She cataloged motives and means as if building a case in real time. Victor loved mentioning how signatures could be copied, how trust could be manufactured and evidence planted so neatly that even scrutiny would slide across it like rain on varnish. He spoke of individuals who would profit from scandal and of others who would vanish when the storm blew through. Each sentence stacked intention upon intention, until the scheme looked less like imagination and more like architecture. Footsteps interrupted Victor's monologue, doors crashed open, and a team moved in with practiced speed. Shouts, radio static, and the heavy sound of boots. Ethan appeared at the warehouse mouth like a storm, his face set into a mask crafted by urgency and worry. The sight of him unleashed a breath Lila had not realized she'd been holding. Victor's smirk faltered into a line of annoyance, then into outrage. He reached for a crate like a man seizing a script from a playwright. Reality sharpened into a violent sequence. A shot cracked, startling and close. A bullet grazed Ethan's forearm, tearing cloth and burning a hot arc along muscle. He staggered but did not fall, and his team closed ranks around him with efficient ferocity. Men moved with deliberate coordination. One tackled Victor to the ground while another restrained accomplices, steel glinting and hands working to secure limb. The struggle felt like a choreographed tempest, each movement aimed at ending danger without further cost. Victor fought with animal hatred, his energy fueled by the cornered certainty of a man whose ambitions had snapped like brittle twine. He spat accusations at Ethan, venom flavored with decades of professional jealousy. For a panicked moment, the world showed both sharp angles and soft edges. Crates overturned, papers scattered like confessions, and the smell of gunpowder tanging the air. A security lieutenant slammed a hand across Victor's mouth as another clipped metal bracelets around wrists. His posture shifted from defiance to tangled defeat. Ethan moved toward Lila with an urgency that bypassed protocol and caution. His hands were trembling as he untied the ropes, fingers steady despite the warm blood along his sleeve. When he pulled the bindings free, her skin flared red and raw where the cord had bitten, and she leaned into him not from weakness, but from the sudden fierce need for human contact that rose like a tide. Their eyes met across a breath filled with accusation and apology, his gaze a complicated ledger of regret and protectiveness. "Why?" she asked, voice small against the cavern's noise. He touched her face gently, his thumb tracing a line along her jaw as if memorizing terrain. "You were never the target," he said. "You were leverage." His voice held a rawness, a close anger that admitted nothing and everything. "They wanted to force my hand or bury me under scandal. You walked into a plot meant to break." She searched his face for deceit and found instead exhaustion and clarity. The minor injury on his arm bled onto the cuff and darkened the fabric where adrenaline had pushed life toward the edges. He winced but remained steadier than the room's chaos. She thought of signatures, transfers, and Victor's satisfied exposition. She thought of the way he had led her into a guarded room of confidences. Their private negotiation in the studio surfaced like a ghost, small gestures now heavy with consequence. Hands steadied around both of them as officers read rights in clipped chains, the metallic language of custody. Victor's protests transformed into muffled admissions, as agents gathered documents in rehearsed statements. Cameras from news vans now staged at the warehouse mouth angled in, but in the middle of such technicality there was only the human scene of two people caught between accusation and relief. When Ethan finally wrapped an arm around her, the embrace was raw. They held without pronouncement, bodies locking to prove presence where words might fail. He smelled of antiseptic and dust and something softer. Her name lingered unspoken in the place where their chests. The warmth of his body pressed into her, smelt in the world reduced to the primacy of breath and pulse. She felt a rush of conflicting truths, relief that the immediate danger had ended, confusion at the scale of betrayal, and a profound sorrow for the cost exacted by secret. His shirt bore the smear of blood, her wrists had raw marks, and between them lay the torn space where trust had nearly unraveled. Later, in a hospital corridor lit by sterile lamps, she watched paramedics tend him and realized consequences ripple farther than any ledger. Reputations fracture, families tremble, livelihoods tilt, and every small kindness once given must now be weighed against the damage deceit can cause. The aftermath would demand patience, truth, accountability, and long reconstruction. In his arms, Lila knew the truth, but the cost was steep. Light filtered through blinds and set hospital dust to gold as Ethan rested on pillows, bandages wrapped around his forearm, where a ragged tear stained fabric with a pale ring of dried blood. Monitors hummed a steady rhythm. The sound steadied Lila more effectively than conversation. She sat on a vinyl chair and held a cup, fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim while she breathed in antiseptic air and cataloged the evening that had collapsed into fact. Ethan watched her with a look that mixed relief and regret, an expression where apology softened into something like awe. He reached across the thin bedspread and took her hand, his thumb finding a familiar ridge that fit his palm. Words pressed against his throat until he gave them a shape. "I couldn't lose you," he said, voice low and raw, the confession landing with the intimacy of a secret finally shared. Lila let the sentence settle, feeling pretenses fall away into memory. She thought of staged smiles and negotiated proximity that began as a pragmatic maneuver and shifted into sequences of honest revelation. "I felt seen," she said, then admitted more plainly that she had come to care in ways a contract could never govern. Their bargain had blossomed into complicated warmth. That fact both thrilled and frightened her. Outside the room, a muted television relayed legal updates, and a media crawl scrolled lines about arrests and filings. A news chyron announced an outcome that made the room taste different. Caldwell Security CEO vindicated, read one anchor as producers calibrated the tone for evening segments. Ethan explained how Victor Lang had exploited internal opacity to manufacture evidence, and how forged signatures had slid into paperwork designed to withstand casual inspection. He described responsibility as layered. Distance between oversight and intimacy had allowed vulnerabilities to be weaponized. He admitted he had prioritized stability and reputation over transparency, a failing that left others exposed to manipulation. When he spoke of those choices, his voice trembled not from theatrics but from the weight of consequence. Lila listened, weighing confession against accountability. She asked direct questions about reforms and governance with the professional clarity left from reporting days. He answered with plans for audits, new compliance officers, and an open invitation for independent review. He promised specific changes: a board committee to oversee trust activity, mandatory rotation for finance executives, and new digital trails to prevent falsified entries. The measures sounded pragmatic and necessary, and she pressed for timelines and measurable milestones. Nurses moved quietly through the ward, and an orderly adjusted a blanket while Ava arrived carrying a small bouquet of lavender tied with a ribbon and a sisterly scold that warmed the room. She hugged Lila fiercely, then hugged Ethan with relief that bordered on theatrical. "You two dramatic fools," she teased, voice bright with admonition and affection. Siblings traded a private syntax that braided concern and levity, reminding them that repair required more than legal filings. It required family presence and patient conversation. They shared memories of childhood summers and design decisions, little domestic details that returned ordinary life to a place beyond headlines. They mapped cautious public appearances, agreeing that transparency would guide statements and that private life required protective boundaries. Ethan described rituals he wanted to share: morning coffee at a narrow table, the habit of leaving handwritten notes rather than texts when travel interfered, and warm lamplight instead of spotlights. Lila sketched ideas for a small domestic studio doubling as a refuge: thicker curtains for privacy, a work table lit by adjustable lamps, and storage for swatches that would never be public. Those ordinary plans felt like stitches that mended more than flesh. They built a language of intimacy, moving away from spectacle toward domestic architecture. Medical staff changed a dressing and applied new bandages while the couple discussed practical choices and future projects. They planned collaborative initiatives: a charity for victims of corporate fraud and a scholarship for investigative reporting, gestures that married accountability with restitution. Lila proposed an exhibit translating forensic documents into public education, tactile installations that demystified opaque practices. Ethan liked the idea, seeing public value in preventative understanding. Their conversation grounded reform in tangible acts rather than vague promises. Later that afternoon, official statements confirmed arrests and outlined charges. Reporters framed the story in sober terms, emphasizing responsibility rather than sensation. Social feeds reposted headlines and analysts debated governance reform. The pivot from accusation to measured accountability redirected public discourse toward evidence and prosecution rather than rumor. For Lila and Ethan, this meant a slow shift: reputations repaired through documentation, not instant absolution. They accepted that restitution would require time and consistent action. As evening settled, the hospital dimmed and visitors thinned. Ethan rested with a calm that gradually replaced adrenaline. Lila leaned into a space beside him, forearms touching, hands knotted in a private sign of solidarity. She observed him in the soft light: small scars at knuckles, a habit of tilting his head when parsing hard information, a half-smile that arrived when he was truly amused. Those details gathered across weeks of proximity became a map of intimacy needing no grand pronouncement. They spoke about rebuilding public presence carefully, selecting interviews that emphasized reforms and avoided exploitation. They agreed on a timeline for transparency releases and council reviews, and they drafted language for statements that would center victims and prosecutors. Ava stayed late bringing takeout and stories, and laughter returned in easy bursts as memory replaced shock and daily concerns knitted into a future whose edges felt less terrifying. Through the night they resolved to make truth their scaffolding and empathy their mortar. When it was time to leave, Ethan insisted on walking her to the door, his step careful though his arm bore a fresh dressing. He paused and met her gaze with the quiet steadiness of someone who had learned to recognize what mattered. "I was wrong to let distance govern action," he said. "I will work every day to make that right." Lila took his hand, feeling both hope and the understanding that trust would not be rebuilt overnight. She pressed a kiss to his forehead as a small ritual and promised to hold him to his word. Before parting, she typed a brief message and posted a gentle prompt for followers. "Love takes courage. Have you ever risked it all? Share your story below to join our community." Responses arrived in steady trickles, offering solidarity, questions, and stories of similar reckoning. Their private repair met a public eager to witness transformation and to share narratives that bound strangers into empathy. Outside the hospital doors, city lights smelt faintly of rain and exhaust, a reminder that life continued in ordinary and extraordinary registers. They walked into the night side by side, footsteps measured and quiet, the public glare receding. They understood consequences would ripple beyond them. Families adjusted, employees recovered, governance shifted, but they also recognized renewal required small habitual acts, honesty at meetings, visible accountability, and everyday kindness. Within those practices they found a way forward. She rested her head against his shoulder and felt the slow exhale that signified calm returning. Between them, performance dissolved into presence. The world had once watched a crafted tableau, and now it watched repair unfold with deliberate care. The world had seen them as a couple before, often as a performance, but now recognition arrived as something steadier. The world saw them as a couple, but now it was real. 1 year later, the vineyard wore summer like a promise. Rows of vines trembled under light while lanterns dangled above a narrow aisle, and guests gathered in a hush that felt like welcome. Lila stood beneath a trellis heavy with fruit and breathed the calm she had earned through trials. Her gown was ivory silk she had sketched and stitched between clients, and it sat with quiet authority that surprised both her and those who had assumed she preferred the shadows. Ava waited at the aisle's head smiling with mischief and sisterly pride. She stepped aside with a flourish that invited Lila into a light the younger twin had rarely claimed. Friends and family sat on weathered benches, faces warmed by sun and by the soft music of a quartet. The air smelt of lavender and warm bread, and small, honest scents. Lila loved when she worked. They walked toward one another with steps chosen rather than imposed, and vows arrived as short sentences rooted in accountability and repair. Ethan spoke with reflection, promising not grand gestures but daily fidelity. "A fidelity, I will show up when fear narrows your view. I will listen without rushing to fix, and I will work so systems protect people rather than conceal mistakes." Lila replied with measured clarity shaped by reporting and design, promising to trust where evidence allowed and to call out deception when silence would harm. Ava offered a wry aside. You always let other people take space until you decide to keep some. And then laughter folded a long history into this bright instant. Tears came from relief and gratitude. Those who had lived through the past months knew healing required patience more than spectacle. After vows, they moved to a reception set on a low terrace where tables held thrifted glass and sprigs of rosemary. Dishes honored local farms and a bakery that once fed the studio crew. Speeches remained intimate and grounded. Friends recounted nights when Lila refused to quit despite rain and broken equipment. Memories that read as proof of perseverance. As dusk softened, fireworks began. Gentle bursts that mirrored the first wedding's opening salvo but served now as punctuation to mended trust rather than spectacle. Lila watched color bloom across the sky and felt satisfaction based on agency rather than attention. Small persistent choices had reshaped her life. Guests drifted toward lantern-lit paths and conversations lowered into confidences. Ava took Lila's hand and led her to a private place where memory braided with future. Ethan's hand found hers in emotion made intimate by repetition. Their first dances felt improvised. Movements born from companionship practiced in private and released publicly without artifice. He rested his forehead against hers and spoke softly. I will work every day to prove worthy of your life. And she promised patient honesty and firm requests, a contract of repair rather than performance. Throughout the evening, gifts reflected values, donations to investigative reporting, a handmade journal for studio notes, and a framed photo from a community fair they had organized. Those offerings grounded celebration in civic purpose. Later they climbed a low rise where valley lights spread in silence braided with memory. Lila traced a pale mark at her wrist and felt its tenderness as a map of survival rather than an ache. Ethan slipped a band onto her finger with fingers that trembled slightly and grinned when she fumbled. The small exacting motion kept meaning intact. Fireworks swelled again, and color spilt into the valley like applause without intent. Lila counted faces who had stood during hard days and returned kindness with steady presence, a tally more precious than any ledger. They spoke of practicalities ahead, governance reforms, public reports centered on transparency, and a charity to teach document literacy so communities could guard against deception. Plans felt purposeful rather than performative and included domestic rituals, morning coffee at a narrow table, a shelf for unfinished sketches, and a rule to leave handwritten notes when travel separated them. Ava teased and then confessed she had learned to share light rather than hoard it, a tiny miracle that prompted a rough hug between sisters who had weathered storms together. As night waned, guests departed under lantern lanes and soft farewells. Vehicles carried neighbors home while vines hummed with summer insects. Before they left, Lila stepped to the reception gate and typed a clear message for followers. If Lila and Ethan's journey from pretense to love moved you, subscribe for more stories that feel real. Comment on where you're watching from, rate this 0 to 10 and support us via the link below to keep these tales alive. Your voice makes our community thrive. She sent the message and turned to Ethan, who looked at her with a quiet wonder. They walked away beneath lantern light hand in hand and felt a quiet that promised work and sustenance rather than spectacle. The world had once viewed them as a performance, and now witnessed repair and steady presence. Lila reflected on the arc from overlooked twin to someone who claimed space thoughtfully. Empowerment arrived through small assertions that accumulated like stitches into a garment that As they reached a low hill, fireworks bloomed one last time, and Ethan wrapped an arm around her. She rested her head on his shoulder with a confidence that had been earned. The night ended without grand pronouncements but with promises acted upon in tiny rituals, and that quiet accountability felt genuine because it would be measured day by day. They left the vineyard joined by friends and family who would continue to measure progress through ordinary interactions, and Lila found relief in the possibility of steady presence. The world had seen them as a couple before, often as an image, but now recognition arrived as something steadier and true. Two people walked into a shared future composed of honesty, kindness, and small habitual generosity that could sustain more than spectacle. After vows, a small group lingered around a long table beneath a pergola where conversations softened into reflection and plans. An elder neighbor praised the couple for choosing repair over spectacle, and mentioned ways the community could support local watchdog journalism. A farmer who supplied vegetables raised a simple toast to honesty, while a designer friend proposed an exhibition pairing textile work with public education about documents and manipulation. Lila absorbed those ideas and felt a new planning horizon, projects combining craft with civic purpose that would reach beyond marriage into public benefit. Ethan discussed governance in plain terms, promising committees and independent audits. His proposals sounded practical and accountable rather than evasive. Guests asked about timelines and oversight and left believing promises here contained concrete mechanisms and named responsibility. In a quiet moment, Ava retrieved an old sketchbook from her car and handed a page to Lila, a private ritual of shared history and creative inheritance that acknowledged past shadows while affirming present strength. The gesture felt both intimate and symbolic, two sisters exchanging an object that stood for endurance and affection. As lanterns dimmed toward ember glow, friends offered farewells that felt sustaining rather than final. Each blessing carried an invitation to steady work in private and public spaces, and to generosity of action.